Hello and welcome to episode 11, Mapping India's Military Space Landscape. To understand the sphere of India's space application for defense and security, we have today with us Dr. Narayan Prasad. Hi, Narayan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Omkar, for having me here.
Likewise, thank you very much for joining us. So, as we'll be taking a deep dive into this topic, so prior to that, can you please provide a brief overview of your career, the organization that you're associated with, and in general, your journey in the space sector?
Sure, happy to. So I've been in the space sector, I would say, for roughly about 15 years now, just over 15 years perhaps. And obviously, initially, as somebody who was involved in microsatellite projects. And, that has led me to spending time in different European countries, Germany, Sweden, France, and so on. And that also led me to working a bit at DLR in Germany, and then eventually going back to India in 2012 to set up Dhruva Space, that is today one of the companies that is very alive and kicking in Hyderabad. So eventually, since the timing of the venture was very hard in India, I decided to exit. And I'm very happy to see that my co-founder Sanjay has carried on from there and has been able to build a substantial business today. But yeah, I made my way back to Europe and set up SatSearch along with my co-founders Karthik and Alberto. And yeah, this has been my entrepreneurial journey. And today, I think SatSearch is close to 7 years old. And it has now customers in about 32 countries. And yeah, this is also given me an impression of what the space industry is, how it works, what can be done from an entrepreneurial standpoint. But alongside my entrepreneurial ventures, I've been also an academic, which would have been my career path if I was not into entrepreneurship. I have obviously taken a deep dive into policy related issues, at least for the last 10 years, where I've really discussed my perspective of space policy, and that obviously includes defense and military security related issues, but not from a political or a geostrategic perspective, but from entrepreneurial perspective of what can be done from a technology perspective to look at the demand that the Indian defense and the military establishment wants to establish itself in, and how that can be promoted in a way that industry can be included in that growth story. So that has been one of the things that I've been looking for the longest amounts of time. So this is also an area of interest. So we've also set up a think tank called Spaceport Sarabhai, which is looking at these kinds of angles and trying to provide advice as well as insights on these lines to further policy making in this regard, and also to support entrepreneurship on these lines.
Amazing. I think the journey that you have from being an engineer to the businessman, and later on even to playing up the leadership roles as well. So I think this podcast episode is going to be very much inspiration for not only the space people or the audience who are going to listen to it, but we have quite a lot of audience from the defense, security, and international affairs. So if I'm not wrong, you recently started the Spaceport Saravai as well, right? As you mentioned.
Yes. So, one of the things that we see as the lack of, thinking in India is an establishment where there is a dedicated focus on space from a think tank perspective.
Yes.
India has a lot of industry associations that are representing various industries as a part of that association. It also has other think tanks like the National Institute of Advanced Studies, or IDSA in Delhi, and CAPS and so on. But none of them have an exclusive focus on space. Space becomes one part of the focus that they have. But we see merit like in mature countries around the world where there is a space program, like Europe or US or other places where they have dedicated space think tanks, and that's the space that we don't see very alive in India. And this is one of the reasons why we made a case for Spaceport Sarabai to exist as a dedicated space think tank, which can really deep dive into the topics instead of just having a smaller focus on it as an overall organization.
Yes, I completely agree with you. I think there has been no such institution or a footprint across India where you can actually do such research or push the policies through the think tank in terms of space, especially the place where the space and international affairs are coming together at one place. So I hope you and your team definitely contribute much from your planning in the spaceport, Sarabhai. Okay, so moving into the topic actually, as we have discussed most of your journey now, and I'd like to know your perspective going ahead. Like, unlike other countries, India has traditionally invested more in civil and scientific space missions. I mean, as far as I know, since my career, I began in the earth sciences. I have been very much, in that area where I have always seen it's only civil and scientific space mission that India has always invested. But in the past few years, we have seen this trend where India is investing more in the military space technology. Recently, the Indian Army was, given a dedicated satellite. So I think it will be in operation from 2026. And so we have overall observed an increase of military space investment in India. So what are your thoughts about that? And from your perspective, what are the prime factors contributing to these increased investments?
Sure. I mean, the thing is, if you go back to the history of the Indian space program itself, there are, let's say, two specific space programs that were based on a civilian front, right? One is Japan and other is India. Japan, for obvious reasons, that they were getting out of the war and they did not want to exploit space as a part of its military program. So that allowed them to only then create a civilian focus. But then, India is another country where we took a stance that India would create or use space and space assets for civilian use cases and to further the applications in the society. That was the stance for the longest amount of time since the beginning of the Indian space program. But obviously, as India has established capabilities over many decades now, and the kind of threats that are emerging in the Indian subcontinent is substantial for the security situation in the country. The interest of exploiting space from a defense and security perspective is gone up tremendously in the last 15 years or so. There are also many marked events, starting from events like the Kargil War, where if we had perhaps enough imaging capacity and enough capacity at very high resolutions, the movements as well as the changes in the terrain in those regions where the war happened could have perhaps been detected and with very early signs, and we could have probably avoided the kind of escalation that had happened. So but it's also about then looking at other possibilities such as space for defense weather related aspects. It could be space for defense PNT related aspects. So there are obviously PNT, weather, meteorology, imaging, communication. All of these have implications or large implications for defense utility as well. So as the kind of threat scenarios are emerging, especially with border issues that India has with both the neighbors, in the north, we have seen a lot of interest in the security establishment to explore this as a part of military modernization, I would say, that involves space as then an angle. So this is the baseline of why there is interest at the end. But it's not unique to India in itself. If you compare what, for example, China is doing today, It has quickly ramped up the capabilities it has in both the launch and as well as in satellite manufacturing. I think China today does about 8 to 10 times the number of launches that India does when in a calendar year, for example. And yeah, depending on the size of the satellite or number of launches, it could be anywhere between even 6 to 10 times. The range varies. But then it also operates today perhaps about 9 to 11 times a bigger satellite fleet than India does with respect to the capabilities that it has. So obviously, this is it makes the capabilities that India has in a very skewed fashion against a neighbor like China, and that means that it has implications to what uh, you know communication and all the other applications that I already talked about. How that will provide an edge to the defense and security forces. It then has an implication to all of that. So therefore, to balance out a lot of these things, as well as to modernize the forces, space becomes a very, very important aspect of this. And the question is, how are we approaching this? In what way is it going to be an industry-led mechanism? It is going to be a government organization-led mechanism. And that is a larger debate that is happening within the system today, for example.
All right. So, as you mentioned, like some of these events have led to the boost of military space applications in India. You mentioned about the Kargil war as well. So, I think India also had lacked abilities in the electronic intelligence during 2611. So, can you little bit extend about that as well? Like, are those also the one of the contributing factors? Because as far as I know, from the naval surveillance point of view, we didn't really had any satellite resources over there. And just a follow-up joint question in that also. The new space is also one of the contributing factor in that. So what is your perspective on overall this? Like there are some of the events which have showcased the gap in India, and there is an emergence of new space as well. So do you think like these two things have come together and are boosting together the military space application growth in India?
Yeah, it's a very ongoing debate and discussion because until recently the scenario for military space had a lot of inertia in the system because what happened as a part of the Kargil situation and then subsequently the Mumbai terror attacks is that India then established a tri-services coordinating body within this defense establishment called the Integrated Defense Staff, IDS, which then eventually, after many years, after almost 10 years, it's turned into a defense space agency and a defense space research organization to look at defense space as a dedicated part of the establishment, right? So now the question really is that ISRO is a civilian organization, and which means that they cannot actively take part in providing dedicated missions to the military, and there may be implications of sanctions and others on them for things like this, right? So now the critical part of all of this is that what sort of capabilities can the industry in India provide, given the nature of the industry and the capabilities of the industry. So unlike many other parts of the world where the industry is very mature, like in the US or Europe or Japan or other places, industry in India for a longest amount of time has been mostly partners in manufacturing of space-related capabilities for ISRO and the defense sector, rather than somebody who is capable of build to spec or a service level agreement led industry where somebody would take ownership of building and flying an entire satellite or building a flying an entire rocket or so on. This is the big change that is occurring today, where a number of companies have invested efforts into either showing that they can build entire satellites by themselves and prove it, or build launch vehicles and show that they can fly that independently in the private sector. So this, I think, opens up a lot of possibilities for the defense establishments, because it provides this foundation for industry to have proven that they also can do something with respect to space, and they can do it as an end-to-end service or an end-to-end product, which means that that opens up the door for then the defense establishment to tender out these contracts where it was almost impossible in the last decade or so, because the industry was not really that mature for it to go to it and say that please build this or so on, right? So the next decade, I think, will be very exciting, because you will see a number of these companies come up live, and they would have proven their capabilities, and hopefully because of that you will see a lot of the interesting aspects of providing defense and security related satellite mission being run from the industry. And that is what seems to then look at the pace at which these capabilities can be matched up globally can only happen in this way, because the private sector brings its own level of efficiency. And I hope that that will then be able to ramp up the capabilities that India will have as a part of the space based tools for military modernization.
Amazing. I think one of the point that you mentioned during the conversation was about the try service. So from this, I get to know, and from the general research also before, coming to the episode that I did, was that there are several institutions that are coming up in India. From the government side, there are some initiatives. And I believe, for example, if we take the securities example or the security sphere example of India, there was one personalities called as Rameshwar Nath Kao. He was one of the prime person to lead the India's security, both for the domestic and the international security. From that perspective, do you believe India is also taking steps in building a leadership roles, or in building a leadership pathway for the people to, not only to handle this institute, but to keep this institute sustainable, healthy, and match up the level at which the United States is at the moment, or several space nations are at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that institutions have their life cycles, and they have their own way of engaging, right, the public. So I'll give you some examples that is probably adjacent to what you already mentioned. For example, the White House has something called the STPI, the Science and Technology Policy Institute, or so on. And then
Yes.
below that, there is a specific think tank called the IDA, the Institute for Defense Analysis. And they are interesting because it is a think tank that is directly under the STPI, and which means that they are actually not funded as a privately backed think tank. They're actually funded by the taxpayer, right? Which means that
Yes.
they are not biased to report something in favor of a private sector organization or so on in any form, right? Or they're not a private think tank that will push an agenda for a particular organization, or even the industry at large. They're really looking at what gives the best return on investment for the country and for the taxpayer. So which means that it's an interesting model, because if you compare that with India has some taxpayer funded think tanks like the IDSA or CAPS and so on, but then they don't do analysis the way IDA does, where IDA is an interesting mix, because they have people who are subject matter experts, as well as political experts, as well as strategic, geostrategic kind of experts, where an engineer meets an economist, where a strategic policy maker meets a political scientist. So when you mix all of these different kinds of profiles and you have people collaborating, that's when you see the real picture, because the The problem that, for example, India suffers is that either it has in some of these think tanks too many former military personnel who don't understand
Yes.
technology, or there
Yeah.
are too many political thinkers who don't understand entrepreneurship.
Yes.
And the techno entrepreneurship angle, or the economics angle of military space and defense space, and how the industry can be engaged, all of these roles are completely missing in these
Yes.
institutions. So
Yes.
I think what really we should look at is, we should not just review one institution, but we should review every type of institution that there is, and look at what incentives do they have, what models are they working in, what can we do. For example, there is no mapping on how big is our supply chain for space in India in a formal fashion. There's no institution looking at all of this. There is no one saying how many jobs we are creating every year, how much investment we are bringing every year, how many exports are we doing for military space every year. Many other topics like this, we don't have a body that is reviewing the status of the ecosystem and making scientific recommendations that is based on primary evidence rather than commentary or personal opinion, or so on, right?
Yeah.
So these are the kind of roles that you then have to look at, and there are these institutional gaps that need to be filled in the country. It could also be that how do we incentivize companies to export more. For example, it could be a dedicated trade body for defense, and in that there is a dedicated wing for defense space, for example, where the Indian diplomacy is using its power to reach out to many countries, and to have like a body like India, Invest India, that is bringing investment to India. It could be Export India, for example, where
Yeah.
they be taking these companies and going into other places and helping them thrive there, and helping them export, so that India earns more as a country, right? So these are all many ideas that we could be exploring as a policy discussion or a debate. And these, so it's not just always one institution; it's many institutions which are to be looked at, and how does each institution then contribute to the overall health of the country and the ecosystem is what is to be discussed.
All right. Yeah, I think what you mentioned is really a gap actually, that the roles of the people in the think tanks are not really streamlined very well as per the need of what needs to be done. So just a follow-up question on the same lines. The US, if we look at the United States, they have several agencies and programs like the Space Development Agency, which actually manages the military space assets, especially the contracting side. Then they have SBR, STTR programs, under which the commercial private space companies have the opportunity to help create and manage the military space asset for its armed forces. So, with respect to India, do you believe the Indian government should take a similar strategic approach to shape the landscape of military space technology and applications?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question because I believe that what we should do is we should review the status of every ecosystem. We should review what the Americans are doing, what the Europeans are doing, what the Chinese are doing, what Russians are doing, what Japanese are doing, South Koreans are doing, for example. And then we should create a model that works for us at the end of the day, which
Yes.
is an Indian model. I don't believe in copying anybody one to one, or you're just following the approach of somebody else one to one. I'll give you an example. For example,
Yes.
I, for example, don't believe in government grants in cash. So there's a
Okay.
lot of people who say that, oh, government should give money to companies to do something. I don't think so. I'm a very big fan of something like that, because it can quickly lead to corruption or favorism to one type of people over the other. And also the return on investment on that will always be bleak, because providing input as money is uncertain for the outcome. It is much rather interesting to give somebody a tender or a contract to deliver something instead. right? So because the
Yeah.
outcome is then established as to what is to be delivered,
Yes.
than giving them simply a bunch of money saying that you're planning to build something, I'll give you money and go build part of this at the end.
Yeah.
So so that is, it could even be in milestones, right? If something is like you're building a 100 kilogram satellite, obviously you need let's say $5 million for it. It may not be that you will give out a tender for it, but even to prove a particular subsystem of that core part of the payload is established, you can break that down as not a grant to give money to build it, but then you show me the progress of you having established this, and I'm going to give you money based on the milestone that you've achieved. And that may lead to more investment as well, right? Because grant is a grant because it's a one time thing and you get it. But then a tender or a anchor customer means that an investor is also then likely to look at it in a positive fashion, because then there is signal from the ecosystem that if there is demand for something, and that demand means that somebody can go there and shop their idea in front of an investor saying that, look, I do have this in place, and it's something that um, you can use to then say that there is the explicit demand from a large customer, and you can then use that to raise some money, right? So this is
Yes.
an approach that you can then take. So yeah, I mean, for me, there are the Indian scenario is very simple. We have a lot of capabilities and infrastructure and people who are capable, and for the last decades or so, we've built up the foundation by having people who understand technology and who have the resources. But the industry at large is still not fully mature to be able to design and operate satellites, and that is the transition that is happening today in the industry, right? But I think the
Yes.
future is about how do you enable bureaucracy to contract such work from the industry, because it's also a question of, do bureaucrats understand how to write tenders to allow the Indian industry to supply imagery or insights for the military.
Yes.
And this is the real challenging bit, which has never been done before. And
Yeah.
hopefully in the coming years, this is something that will be clearly established, and you'll see in the next few years that there's also government establishments putting out tenders saying, I want to have a change detection as a service based on synthetic aperture radar or hyperspectral imaging, or multispectral, whatever it is. Or I want to have uh, a survey, IoT service, or a communication broadband service over a certain areas, and so on. So
Yes.
these are all some of the things that needs to then happen for the ecosystem to then grow. But then, as I said, it's not about, again, an institution like SDA or whatever at the end, but it's about what mechanisms and which institutions are then involved. The best is when the end user is directly involved with the industry, because the
Yes.
end user knows what is needed. And if there are no bureaucratic institutions in between the end user and the industry, that's when you have a very simple way of knowing what the end user wants, and the end user can directly contract the industry
Yes.
to what it is.
This is a very important point that you mentioned about that the bureaucrats, so a lot of times they don't know what exactly the Indian Armed Forces want, or in general what the military wants. I think that is one of the biggest point of my podcast. The reason I initiated this as a space defense and security is to actually not only to provide an international affairs perspective to the space industry, but actually to help the international affairs geopolitical analyst to let them know what exactly happens in the space industry, because there are things beyond the satellite market that work. And I think the policy making, the way the commercialization work, I think the privatization is very new to India still. It's been just few years. It's not been a several decades. So I think this sector needs to educate itself. And I'm as one of the experts in the industry, that's what my aim is through this podcast, is to actually educate the people about the space, and also for the military domain, where people can actually know what expertise need to go, what are the gaps there in the system. As you mentioned, like a lot of times the bureaucrats don't know what exactly needs to be done in the contract. So yeah, I believe, I hope, I hope to educate the people through this podcast. So yeah, just to get a little back, actually, you mentioned about that we have to look at the other countries' programs as well. And in that, you mentioned about China. The reason I'm very much interested about China is because they recently, like, surrounding all the Indian neighborhood, uh, we have seen like they have deployed by the navigation system at a very rapid pace since 2018 and 2019. And so with respect to that, what are your thoughts about the Navic system, which is also, I think, called as IRNSS, and how it is helping the Indian Defense Forces?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So this is a critical part of one of the triads in the space defense space, right? Alongside remote sensing and communication. Uh, as perhaps in GPS is a very interesting system because for a long time it was only for the military and it was opened up to the entire world. And then a lot of the defense forces also started adopting GPS within their systems. And several wars, including the war in Iraq and other places, and even over India, I think there's been cases where the GPS was denied in environments where there was a threat scenario, and it allows the US to switch off the system in certain regions at certain times of their wish. So obviously, this has led to several other countries who to establish their own, GNSS positioning system. Obviously, this includes countries like Japan, China, Russia, Europe, and even South Korea, I think now. So this this means that obviously that forced India to have a to think about these kinds of implications for its systems. But I think the larger debate of all of this is that you need higher accuracy for a lot of things that need precision. So, for example, it could be for drones, for example, or it could be for precise missiles and so on. And obviously, the
Yes.
military frequencies of the GPS is owned by the US government, and that may not be something that you can use for your defense forces. So it's a combination of both the independence of operating your own system and having ownership of that, as well as then the higher precision that you may get as a part of owning your own system in one form or the other. These are the two things that any military would then be interested in having their own systems in place, right? So,
Yes.
but now Navik as a beginner was looked at. I mean, it also serves civilian purposes, obviously, and it could create an ecosystem for Navik receivers. You know that many of the chipset manufacturers like Qualcomm and others have adopted Navik as a part of their chipsets, and that is already being used in smartphones as well. But then there is the independence that the country gets, which is interesting, that it brings along. But then the future of this would be in embedding an ecosystem of India made, India led, and localized technologies, and that could go into all kinds of things. So for example, you could integrate that with weather stations. You can integrate that with aircrafts, with drones, with missiles, and so on. So it has its ecosystem that then brings it advantages, right? So this is
Yes.
the most interesting part of it. And then Travik right now has a limited service area. It's around the Indian
Okay.
subcontinent. I think it extends only until the beginning of Africa on that side, and Southeast Asia on the other side. But I read that recently that there is also plans of extending the IRNSS or the Navik service to all around the world. This obviously then has implications to ICBM delivery and many other aspects that can then
Yes.
be supported in one form or the other. But I think that will obviously take some time because they need to put up new satellites and yeah, and so on. So, but yeah, the future seems to be very interesting with these things.
Okay. Yeah, this is quite interesting looking at how India is also, planning to reach up to that level. But yeah, thank you for, clarifying that, because I just had a perspective more from the China point of view, where they have been deploying it very rapidly. And that's the reason I was a bit interested into the Indian navigation system as well. So moving forward, looking at the international relations, especially. So we have seen there are countries like Australia who primarily invest in wideband global satellite system, but don't really take um much advantage of their investment. Uh, so that gives a sense that their investment in WGS is kind of strategic to keep up the military relations with the United States is one of its biggest allies. So from that perspective, do you believe international relations in general affect India's decision making in the military space segment?
It's a tough question because at the end of the day, I think everybody understands that a country of the size of India, which is today the largest, perhaps the largest country in the world, it's probably overtaken China in terms of population. Um, that there needs to be some level of independence to all systems at the end.
Yeah.
So I think we've come a long way because from facing sanctions from the US for running the a military program to then having the scenario completely change in about 5 decades is a very interesting scenario today, right? Where the implications are that, but also there's a geopolitical angle to all of this because today that the Indo-Pacific is becoming a very large theater for interest for all countries in the region. And this is a very interesting discussion because people are talking about for example, India being a part of many other forums such as I don't know, AUKUS or Five Eyes or many other. It could be in many years that India could be part of all of that, including forums like the Quad or others.
Yes.
But the Indo-Pacific is one of the extremely interesting phenomena. So the thing is that obviously, from an Indian perspective, I think every policymaker in India perhaps wants to not depend on any other country to maintain the ability to do policy and to have stances that are independent of any country. And India also is not a country that subscribes to this angle of being called an ally from somebody else. It's a very
Yes.
Western phenomena, right? So to take an angle of that nature or take a
Yeah.
word of that nature, so which means that these mean that at the end, the policymaker in India, whoever it is, either the foreign policy or even the defense policy or so on, is mostly then centered around having independence in terms of capabilities, because that is the only way that you can be self-reliant and also
Yes.
independent. But also what it does, it gives you respect in the table
Yes.
at the same time. So I think the future is then, and at least in my opinion, is about having incredibly well developed independent capabilities
Yeah.
that can be used to either be equals in collaboration or to have equal voice in the table in one form or the other. And that comes from showing that you have enough capabilities yourself, and you have you can run your show independently, right? That's when you get respect
Yes.
to a large extent. So that's the future that I see in all of this.
Okay. Thank you very much. So, like, I think we are already, you know, uh, approaching the end of the podcast. Uh, so, as a space industry expert, what message would you like to give to the future generation stepping into this field of military space research, or even as in general, space technology?
I would say that the future generations, especially the Indian future generation, I think the possibilities today are endless. Because maybe 15 years ago when I was a young student, the kind of range of jobs and the kind of organizations that were involved in space and defense as an intersection was very limited at the end.
Yes.
And the number of jobs in a country like India at that point of time would be like hardly less than 500, I would say, in a
Yeah.
year. So there was a lot of competition and so on. So but I think that scenario has changed in 15 years time, and the next 15 years or so will be extremely interesting, because obviously there are many new startups, many new large companies that are investing in space related aspects. And that means that there is both for people to take entrepreneurial stances and to raise capital and to raise in to build technologies and products will be very interesting. I mean, who would imagine, for example, that rifles and automatic guns will be built by a private sector company in India 15 years ago? It was probably unimaginable, but it is happening today. That private sector people are building such capabilities and are able to deliver such products. But that, I think, will spill over
Yes.
to space as well, which means that there will be thousands of jobs, new jobs being created, lots of
Yes.
investment that are coming through, a lot of support. And which means that if people have either original ideas that they want to pursue, they can do that. They can probably take that to reality, and the environment is there for them. Or if they want to just find a team or find a company that they want to then work with and lead a certain type of technology in whatever AI or many other aspects that are coming through, that also then becomes a possibility for them. So you can imagine, the from being in a scenario where very limited institutions, very limited funding, very limited job opportunities and so on, to almost unlimited scope that is present.
Yes.
So the kind of possibilities are endless for the next generation.
Yes, I completely agree with you. The possibilities are absolutely completely endless because even I observed the same thing back when I was pursuing my bachelor's in earth sciences in 2011 and 12. There were not many opportunities, and I feel the current generation really has a lot of advantage, not only the government sector, but especially in the private and commercial sector, where they can actually participate, experiment, and make something of their own, while also helping the national economy in the process. So yeah, thank you very much, Narayan, for providing such amazing insights on military space landscape of India. And I hope we also create a follow-up episode in the future, because I'm pretty sure from the audience side there are going to be several questions or messages or email I'm going to receive for the pointers, especially the one that you mentioned, that the bureaucrats and the kind of people which are involved in the think tanks or the policy making don't really have the knowledge of, a complete, I would say, a general knowledge of the space industry. So I hope we again create a follow-up episode as well. Thank you very much for your time, Narayan.
Absolutely. Thank you again for having me here. I hope whatever I said made sense to the listeners. And if anybody wants to reach out to me to discuss any aspects of it, or has any opinions that is tangential to what I mentioned, I'm happy to have a discussion with them.
Definitely. Thank you very much. I think I'll be also uploading your contact details in the description below the episode. So definitely the audience can actually, reach out to you directly.
Thank you so much, Omkar.
Yes.